Hello, I'm Rebecca Weber. You're listening to AMAC's podcast, Better for America. Joining me today is Hans von Spakovsky, a leading expert in election law in the United States. He's also a manager in election law reform initiative and senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Hans, it's a joy to have you with me. Thank you so much for being here.
Rebecca, it's always nice to talk to you.
Many have complained that while the state legislatures are responsible for election law, we're seeing outside influence from federal agencies as well as corporate or non-government entities. I'm wondering if we could start off by you providing us with sort of the big picture view on how election reform is progressing.
Well, we have the most decentralized election system of any Western democracy. I mean, you go to Europe and other countries and they have a federal central government agency that runs elections. That's not the case here. Our elections are run by states. In fact, in states, they're run down at the county and in some states, township level. The federal government's role is that we do have laws, as you know, like the Voting Rights Act, that say you can't discriminate in the voting context. And Congress also passed a couple of other statutes, including the UACAVA law. That's the law that guarantees overseas military personnel the ability to vote in our elections. And of course, the National Voter Registration Act, which set out rules for registering to vote in federal elections. But other than that, it's really the the state government that runs this. Now, for quite a while, folks on the political left and their advocacy organizations have been pushing. They want the federal government to basically take over the election process. And the reason for that is that they don't like the kind of reforms that states have been passing, like requiring an ID to vote. And it's a lot of work for them to oppose that in each state. And they'd rather have the federal government just come in and say, voter ID, you're banned from doing that. In fact, that was a provision in H.R. 1. It would have banned all voter ID laws across the country. The thing that the federal government ought to be doing is actually kind of well expressed in a bill that Republicans on the House side recently dropped called the ACE Act. That's the American Confidence in Elections Act. And what that bill does is it basically requires the federal government to help or assist the states in running their elections. And to give you an example, as you know, you got to be a citizen to vote. Well, who's got the best information on aliens in this country? Obviously, the Department of Homeland Security. And so this federal bill would tell DHS, you must provide information to state election officials when they want to check on the citizenship status of a registered voter. That's what the federal government ought to be doing, helping the states when they can, but not telling them what to do.
Yeah, I mean, that entirely changes how our elections are run if that were to happen. And what I find so interesting that nobody's really talking about is the will of the American people. A recent poll that I came across said that 89% of Americans, including Black Americans, minority groups, overwhelmingly are for voter ID, for example, and
Right.
are against mail-in ballots and prefer that the vote and midnight on election day, you can't vote after that, after that time. This is the kind of thing that American people want. Yet we've got a small group, a minority, that's really fighting to take over. And that's very concerning to our AMAC members. So thank you for that great perspective. I do want to talk 2016 versus 2020. In 2020, we had COVID, a very unusual, that only happens maybe every 100 years, right? We saw
Right.
mail-in ballots like crazy. Law changes in places like Wisconsin, which allowed hundreds of thousands of, indefinitely confined voters. I mean, we saw election law changes, sometimes usurping the legislative bodies. What is different in your view in 2024 versus 2020 and how things were handled? Do you see the landscape entirely improved, changed, or the same?
Well, I think we're actually going to be better off in 2024 than we were in 2020. And the reason for that is that, look, Rebecca, I've been talking about and making recommendations for improvements to state election laws for a very long time. But it was always tough to get state legislators to pay any attention to this. Well, the one thing the 2020 election did is it suddenly made them realize, we actually should try to fix some of the holes in our system. And for example, we had a huge increase, unfortunately, in mail-in ballots in 2020. Not as many people took advantage of that in the 2022 midterm, but one thing the states did, many of them, is they said, well, look, if we're going to have an ID requirement, it obviously should not just apply to in-person voting, but also to mail-in ballots. Georgia passed a requirement like that. Florida passed a requirement like that. Texas did too, and a number of other states. So they actually, look, absentee ballots, unfortunately, are here to stay, but by putting in an ID requirement for them, they made them more secure. Also, a number of states passed bans on what the left likes to call ballot harvesting, what I call ballot trafficking, which is, the left wants strangers to be able to go to people's houses to pick up their ballots, which is a very valuable commodity. They want their party activists and their campaign staffers to be able to do that. And if they do that, well, they're in a position to pressure the voters to potentially change their votes once they have the ballot in hand. And a number of states, Arizona, for example, being an example, they banned that. Yeah, you can deliver your ballot, your family can deliver your ballot, a caretaker, but not third-party strangers. And listen, Arizona actually got sued by the Democratic Party saying, oh, you can't do that. Arizona took that case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and Supreme Court said, no, that's a common sense security measure, and yes, Arizona can do that, and the DNC was defeated.
Yeah, I think all of the work that you're doing is so important. Here at AMAC, we are so focused on election integrity. We're fighting back against this confusing ranked choice voting, very confusing. We've got a lot of information on our website so people can learn more about how to get involved, how to participate as a poll watcher, and how to participate in the entire election process. We've got to make sure that our elections are free and fair and that every legal vote counts. But before I move on, when I think of 2016 versus 2020, in 2016, Trump was not nearly as popular, in my view, as a citizen. As I look at the landscape, I said in 2020, he seemed to really, his popularity had soared within his own party. How exactly did Trump win in 2016, in your view?
The real difference between 2016 and 2020 was, as you have said, the huge increase in voting by mail. And what's happening now is, like Virginia, as you know, has off-year elections coming up. And the Virginia governor has started a campaign to get people to vote early and vote by mail. When people ask me what I think about that, what I say is, well, you play by the rules in place when the election is ongoing. That doesn't mean, however, that you don't try to fix those rules later to try to make them better. In this particular case, because Republicans don't control the state house entirely, they have been unable to change back some of the very liberal rules that Democrats put in, rules that I think risk the security of the election process. So what's happening is Republicans are taking advantage of that, but I still think they do want to change them back to better rules. Virginia used to have actually a good voter ID law. When Democrats took control of the government, they got rid of it. So in this upcoming election, you won't have to show an ID to vote in Virginia. But clearly, I think that if Republicans get control of the legislature, they're very much in favor of that. So I think they'll change the law back.
Well, that's something good to look forward to, we hope and pray. And our members and many who are in Trump's corner, they're hoping that President Trump's team will finally be able to present evidence of voter fraud when he goes to trial in the Georgia indictment case, which I think is the spring of 2024. Now, Hans, you worked for Trump. You spent even more years in the election integrity field. What's your take on Fani Willis, this far-reaching indictment and criminalizing lawfully protected First Amendment speech?
Yeah, I have to tell you that indictment in Florida, I'm sorry, in Georgia is an unbelievable abuse of the legal system. You have a local prosecutor criminally prosecuting individuals for engaging in protected First Amendment activity. One, speaking out and contesting the outcome of an election. I'm sorry, that's basic First Amendment activity. Also, she says that in their efforts to speak to state officials, like the legislature, to try to get them to investigate what happened, that's criminal activity too. Sorry, but that's also protected by the First Amendment. Look, I'm afraid that Donald Trump and the other defendants are being targeted by a politically ambitious, totally partisan, unethical, and unprofessional local DA who sees this case as her ticket to being known nationally in her own political party, the Democrats. But at the same time, it is a real threat to our democratic process.
Yeah, and going after people because of their honest opinion and belief that something seemed wrong, and doing what they thought was good. I mean, we've heard Hillary Clinton complain on and on how the election was stolen from her in 2016, and all of her made up Russia hoax story and so on. It's like going after the wrong people entirely. Americans are waking up; they're seeing it. AMAC members see what's really happening, and he's got to be able to win this stuff because it does impact the future of our country.
Right.
Election integrity is certainly top of mind for so many Americans and AMAC members, as I've mentioned, because of the 2020 election. Now, the book that you co-authored, Who's Counting? How Fraudsters and Bureaucrats Put Your Vote at Risk, you wrote that book in 2012. So clearly, Hans, this issue has been prevalent for such a long time now. Has election fraud become more prevalent of late, or was it really always this bad, but we never noticed and we're just paying better attention now?
Well, I'll tell you, we've always had fraud in our elections. In fact, a lot of people don't realize this, but the first time we ever used absentee ballots in this country was in the 1864 election when Abraham Lincoln was trying to get reelected. And there was a very significant fraud case in which the governor of New York, who hated Abraham Lincoln, organized an effort to try to steal the mail-in ballots of Union troops who had been wounded and were in hospitals. So from the very first time, for example, we used absentee ballots, there was an attempt to use them to change the outcome of an election. Look, I don't know if it's more prevalent today or not. I actually think it probably was more prevalent in our early history because we do have a lot of safeguards in place today, but it still occurs. And anyone who doubts that, just take a look at the election fraud database that the Heritage Foundation maintains. We just added about a dozen more cases to it. We're now up to, I think, 1,453 proven cases of fraud just in the last 20 years that you'll find in our database.
Wow. Good for you. I'm glad that you're tracking that information. People need to see this. Do you feel that enough election integrity measures have been taken to ensure that, unlike 2020, the 2024 election will be free, fair, and secure? This is a question that we hear over and over again from our membership.
Things are improved, but no state has done absolutely everything they can. Another way for people to judge that very easily is we started something else, Rebecca. It's called our Election Integrity Scorecard. And we actually score every single state in the country against a set of best practices criteria that we came up with on election security. And the highest score in the country is in the low 80s. So no state has scored 100. So while a number of states have improved things, but they're still not perfect. There's still room for improvement. And there are some states in the country, like New York and California, Nevada, Hawaii, that are at the very bottom of our scorecard. If this was a college grade or a college exam, they would be flunked out and expelled.
Wow. So it is that bad. It's a shame. But the good news here is that we do see inch by inch some common sense legislation is being passed.
Right.
Are you optimistic about the future as it relates to our election laws and election integrity here in America?
Like I said, I'm actually optimistic. I'm optimistic about the 24 election because so many states have improved things. Yeah, we still have states that haven't done what they should about this, but overall, we're going to be in better shape. Particularly, remember, Georgia was a big question mark in the last election, and yet Georgia passed a reform bill that was so good. Remember that Joe Biden went all the way to Atlanta to give a speech condemning it. Now, if he was condemning it, that tells you that those were good reforms.
Isn't that a shame? I love this idea of the scorecard. That is a fabulous tool, and I know our members will want to check that out. I'm sure they can find that right there on your website at the Heritage Foundation. Right. Before we let you go, Hans, tell us about any other initiatives that the Heritage Foundation has on the horizon regarding election integrity.
Well, the biggest thing that we've been doing is pushing states to do something they haven't ever really done before, which is to make auditing a standard process of elections. Look, Rebecca, you and I both know, right? Auditing is ubiquitous in the business world, right? Every company, every business has to undergo yearly audits, yet that's not done in elections. And so we've been really pushing states hard to come up with a standard auditing process post-election where you go back and you look at everything that was done in that election to see what was done right, what was done wrong, and to fix any problems to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Very good. Well, I applaud all of you for the great work that the Heritage Foundation does, and we support you entirely, Hans. Thank you so much for being with me today. As I mentioned, AMAC members feel very strong about election integrity. It's a number one concern. I know that they will be thrilled to have heard your perspective today. Thank you again. God bless you, and I hope to have you back with me again very soon, Hans.
Sure. Happy to talk to you anytime.
Today's episode is sponsored by Emergency Assistance Plus. Now, your membership with EA Plus provides you with an extra layer of protection anytime you travel. Whether you're thousands of miles away or on a short road trip away from home, you'll have peace of mind should a medical emergency arise. EA Plus membership gives you access to a team of highly skilled professionals, and they will ensure that you receive proper medical care and get fast and reliable transportation home. Get that extra layer of protection anytime you travel. Become an EA Plus member today. Call EA Plus at 800-445-3575 or visit emergencyassistanceplus.com/BFA podcast.
The Association of Mature American Citizens is the conservative voice for Americans 50 and older. AMAC is fighting for the values that you hold dear. Join today. Together, we can write the course of America.